All right, well, I am so glad you are all staying. Some new faces that we had from yesterday and also some others that have joined us from this morning. So welcome everybody. And we are going to be talking about serging some garments. We're going to talk about serging in general also, because every time I go out, I find that there are just those burning questions that people are like, I didn't know about needles, or I didn't know that sergers could do all these different kinds of stitches. So the first thing that I would like to do is let's talk a little bit about different stitches that are on sergers, okay? And what I have here are some different stitch setups, and we're going to talk, and when we talk about sergers and garment construction, we kind of touched on this yesterday where customers had said, how many of you here were not here yesterday? Okay, all right, so we talked about quilting with our sergers and assembling, piecing with our sergers. And many times quilters might say, well, I don't need a serger because I piece and I piece my quilts. And I don't necessarily see a reason for that because those are machines that make garments. Okay, that's a general thought, and that's where they started. But today, what we're wanting to do is spend a little bit of time with garments, but also then talk a little. Are you going to be able to see those stitches on there? Put them down here. Okay. Yeah, he's a great cameraman. So let's take a look at some of these stitches. So the first one that I want to start out with is called a combo stitch. Okay, so sergers can do a combination stitch. So machines that are combo machines that do chain stitching, cover stitching, as well as overlock stitches are called combos, right? Most of the time we think of sergers that are doing a 4-3 2-thread overlock stitch. So a combo stitch will allow us to sew an overlock stitch along with a chain stitch, making our seam. Okay, now let's take a look at these three together. So can you see that the first one gives us an overlock with a full 5/8 inch seam allowance? So if you are sewing a garment together and you might want to have more flexibility in your seam allowance, you could use that combo stitch and still have the flexibility before the buffet and after the buffet if you need to have flexibility in your seam allowances. Okay? So 5/8 of an inch. Now, that is, and if you would, Jack, you won't be able to see it. We'll show it later. But what you will have in your cover stitch is you have 3 different needle positions. So you have left needle, center needle, and right needle position. So when I sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, I use my left needle position. Okay, my left needle position. When I want a 1/2 inch seam allowance, middle, and 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, I use my right needle position. Does that make sense? Okay, now swing on over here to the machine, Jack, for just a minute, because again, we have the seam guide that you can mount onto the table. So now when I'm stitching, if I have my machine set up for that 3/8 inch seam allowance, I can run the edge of my fabric right along that seam guide, and I know my seam is going to be straight. And it will only then skim the edge of my fabric. Okay? Now, how do I know what that seam allowance is going to be? So you notice on the toe of your presser foot, and all of your machines have this, they have these little raised marks that are on the front of the toe of your presser foot. So depending upon the position of the needle that you are in, you measure over from that needle edge or mark to the raised part of your seam guide, and that would give you your seam allowance width. Make sense? Yeah? Okay. Perfect. So now you can determine and get an exact seam width, whether again you're doing your 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/8 of an inch with a combo stitch. Now, let's take a look then, and these are the stitches that you look at or think about most commonly with your overlock stitch, and this is the overlock 4-thread stitch, right? So when we stitch that, a lot of times you will have your seam allowance, and this is where a seam that you may think, that's just not quite enough width. But you can adjust the width of this stitch all the way up to 9 millimeters in width, which is on the Bernina, okay? Which is this gold, the width of that gold stitching, okay, on your fabric. So you could have your seam or decorative stitches be that wide when you're going to be putting a seam together, okay? And then again, still measuring over from the needle mark that you're going to be working with. All right, now another stitch that, and that's the 4-thread, and of course then you have the 3-thread stitch, the 3-thread stitch that you would use on lighter weight fabrics, lingerie, something that's going to be, that you might want to have a very light seam allowance for. And again, you can use that seam width, depending upon which needle you're going to work with, either all the way as wide as 9, or you can have it as narrow as 3 millimeters in size, okay? Now, the other stitch that we typically think about and work with is this rolled hem. And a lot of us will like to use this rolled hem. If you're doing ruffles for a garment, or you're going to be using any type of lightweight fabric, I'm just going to throw these on the floor because it'll be easier to find. So if I'm doing the rolled hem on the edge of this sheer fabric, okay, that beautiful rolled hem that's there, it will roll the edge and I don't have to do a double turned hem, okay? But now, sometimes what happens is our rolled hem, can you see those little prickles that come out of the edge? The pokies that come out. So sometimes what will happen is those little pokies happen, and you will generally get pokies on the crosswise grain rather than on the lengthwise grain. So whether you're doing pin tucks or you're going to be doing, even if you're doing ruffles and things, it is always better to cut them on the lengthwise grain than on the crosswise grain, okay, because of the fibers and the way that they're woven. But now when you do those and eliminate those pokies, a lot of times what you can use is a water-soluble or a press-away stabilizer and lay it right on the top. And when you stitch it, it's going to roll into that fabric edge, okay? This is a press-away stabilizer, or you can use a water-soluble stabilizer. Then you just tear off the edge. However, when you set your rolled hem, and if you set your rolled hem manually, if you set it too short, what it does is it perforates the edge of your fabric. So if it's not rolling over enough of the edge of the fabric, guess what? Your rolled hem falls off the edge, okay? It's kind of like your checkbook, right? When you tear a check out, the perforated marks that are on there, well, who uses a checkbook anymore, right? I do too. My grocery store does not take electronic payment. Apple Pay, like Apple Pay. So I go through the checkout, and the person behind me is looking at me like, you don't have a debit card? I'm like, it's on my phone, but they don't take electronic payment. Right. So anyway, you can use the water-soluble stabilizer. If you shorten your stitch too short, it could pull off the edge. So a lot of times what we will do is we will use a decorative thread. And when you use a decorative thread, the stitches don't need to be real close together. So if you're using a fragile fabric, lengthen out your stitch just a little bit. Use a more decorative thread, a little heavier weight thread. Then your stitches are going to be able to be spread out farther. Okay? 12. A 12 weight. You can use the woolly nylon thread. That's a beautiful thread to use. Tomorrow we'll talk also about embellishments that you can make with your sergers and how you can pull some of these other types of threads through your machines too. But you can also use woolly nylon, obviously, is a nylon thread. And it's fuzzy, right? And it's stretchy. If you take an iron and you press on it, guess what's going to happen? It'll melt. Now, the Maxi Lock poly stretch thread is polyester. So it has a much higher melting temperature, so you can press it. And a lot of times people will use those types of threads on napkins, okay, because they fill in the edge of the fabric very nicely. But if you're using a cloth napkin, you may want to press it. So using a poly thread rather than a nylon thread, you'll be able to press your napkins more easily. Okay? All right. Other rolled hem questions before I say something else?
And do those go in the upper looper?
Yes. So the question was, and I was asked to repeat the question for all of the people viewing out in the front. So, what was the question? Does it go in the upper looper? Okay, yes. So it's been a long day. Yes, your rolled hem thread will go in the upper looper, okay? Because that's the only thread that you're really going to see. So when you're working with a decorative thread, place it in your upper looper. If you need to have if you have a fabric that is kind of stiff and cantankerous and you want it to roll around the edge, use your woolly thread in your lower looper, because the tension that's on that thread, when it goes out through the machine, it kind of springs forward. Then when it goes onto the stitch, it relaxes. Right? So that's going to help pull that fabric around and hold that stitch tighter on the underside.
So either one.
Either one. But you don't have to put it in both. You can use regular thread in the lower looper. Okay? Now, in the upper looper. So one more thing I want to share with you is to eliminate these little pokey edges that are on the edge of your fabric. What you can also do on your machine, and I'm just going to take this and swing it out of the way. So we're going to look at the blade for just a minute. Because we skim along the edge of our fabric, the rolled hem, oops, what was back there? It was a tray, yeah. Sorry. So with the rolled hem, can you see right back here? You see the stitch, outside stitch finger. You can pull it back and move it forward. So when you do the rolled hem, you pull it backwards. And it forms just around that one single teeny little stitch finger. Yes?
Is that only on a Bernina?
No.
Okay.
Where the position is, yes. Okay? On your baby lock machines, you have a knob down here on the side of your machine that you adjust the length and your width at the same time. Okay? And then you turn it all the way around and it goes to your rolled hem. Okay? Here, I have full control of the width and position of my stitch. So what I can do is I can take the stitch finger, I can pull it back out of the way, and watch my cutting blade. I can adjust the position of my cutting blade independently. So now when I get these little pokies, I can turn my cutting blade just a fraction wider. So now when I stitch, it's going to take a smidgy more fabric and roll it around the edge and curl it under. Okay? So that's how you can also eliminate those little pokey edges on your fabric. Yeah?
When you have a really fine fabric that frays easily,
Yep.
what are some things you can do to keep it from pulling off the edge?
That's when I would use the stabilizer, and I would lay it on the top and let it roll into the rolled hem. Okay? Because that's going to help.
But that's going to wash out, right?
This one is a press away. Okay, this particular clear is a press away product. So it would remain in your rolled hem. Okay?
Could you use
Would
wash
you
away?
try to
You-
make it a thicker,
You could use wash away.
a wider roll?
Yep, you can use a wider roll as well. If it's a thin fabric that isn't sheer, you could also put on that, and I have it in here somewhere. It's the knit stay tape that you can fuse on the back side, and then you can allow it to roll into that. Okay?
My granddaughter bought a dress, and it was already that way, brand new, and I was trying to fix it. It was impossible. I couldn't do anything with it. So yesterday I bought that for that very reason.
Yeah, well, there you go. There, and you can also put in, if it is sheer, you can cut or purchase a sheer organza piece of fabric and lay it underneath. Okay, lay it underneath, and then it'll roll it in, and it's still underneath, and then you can use your duckbill scissors and trim it carefully.
You gotta be very careful.
Very careful. Question?
I can't remember the name. It's not the best press, but is it teal or
Material Magic.
does that help in this case? I haven't used it yet, but I've been curious.
So when you use Terrial Magic, the Terrial Magic, if you put that on the edge, what's going to happen is it will make the edge of your fabric so stiff that it will be harder to go around the edge. Okay? It won't bend. You want something that's fairly soft that will bend. Okay? That will bend around the edge. Okay? Yeah, something a little more pliable.
What's the name of that one that you just showed, like that
Press away.
The thread? No. Oh, this clear one? This is called Press Away.
it's press away.
Yes, Press Away.
But if I want to buy that, do I need to say that it's for serger or?
Nope,
just-
nope, nope, nope. Nope, this is embroidery. This is under embroidery. Yeah. There's many crossover items that you can use, and this Press Away would be definitely one of those items. Okay? Question, Brad? No? We doing all right? Everything working all right? Okay, good. Okay, other questions on rolled hems? Okay, all right. The other thing is when you are working with sometimes your presser feet, and I'm going to pull these two out, and they're going to look similar, and so you have different feet. So there are the clear feet, there's the standard presser foot, and there is, I should probably just pull it out of here. which is a shearing foot, okay? So these 3 feet are pretty much identical with obvious differences. The clear one is clear, and it has all of the same markings. The standard foot, do you see how it has this little bump that's on the side? So when you're stitching, you see how it has this little bump, okay? What happens is it takes the front of the foot and it like tips it up and holds it off of the bed of the machine. So when you get snow here, right? A little bit. Sometimes. Okay. But you understand that what happens with the snowplow is as they come through, it's going to kind of, the front of it has to be lifted up a little bit to get over that snow, right? So this is a foot that is designed to traverse over seams more easily. Okay, so it will traverse over the seams, and this little bump is going to help lift the toe of your foot. The other foot is completely flat. So when I'm stitching on very lightweight fabrics, I like to use this foot because it is coming in contact with all of my feed dogs, and the front is going to pick up that very sheer fabric or lightweight fabric and pull it through. Otherwise, there's a little gap underneath, and it's not holding that fabric snugly onto the feed dogs. Whether you're doing shearing, they have to put a name on it, so they called it a shearing foot. Yeah. Okay, so that's even on your baby lock machines. The shearing foot is flat, and it will help whether you're gathering or not gathering. Okay? Alrighty then. So now, when we're working with
Clear foot,
the
best use for the clear foot.
clear foot is just for times you want to see. So anytime you want to see
Very flat.
and it's very flat. It does not have that bump that's on the side, and it is the same as the shearing foot, only it's clear. And it will allow you to stitch going through, seeing lines that you would be stitching, or if you would be applying, let's say, a ribbon or a rickrack, and you want to have just one of the needles catching one of the edges of that rickrack, then you can see it through your foot. Okay? All right. Now, also, when you're going to be stitching, and I have this set for a 4-thread overlock stitch, and the first, I'm going to set these down and not remember where I put them. So I'm just going to set them here for right now. All right? All right. So now what I'm going to do is just stitch a line of stitching, and I'm using a 4-thread overlock stitch. Now that's kind of the typical stitch that you use with your serger for seaming. I'm going to set my width at 7.5. That's the wide width.
Can you show the setting the width again?
Oh, right here. Down here at the bottom. I'm going to set the width. Okay. And I also want to make sure, I said 7. Okay. And I'm going to make sure that my rolled hem lever is set on overlock. Okay. Now, on the screen, it's already set the length of my stitch. Remember, we have needle position that's there, so if I'm wanting to pivot or stop and reposition my fabrics, I can. And then across the top, we're going to talk about those little colored boxes in just a minute. So now, if I'm going to be seaming together a piece of fabric as, hopefully everybody's sewing table looks just like this at home. Okay. Looks worse sometimes. I know. All right, so what I've done is I'm going to be making, let's say I'm making a t-shirt, right? And I have my seam across the top, the shoulder seam, right? So when I stitch this shoulder seam, I have placed a piece of that seam tape, that fusible seam tape on there. You can either use the fusible seam tape, or you can use a self fabric, that's the lengthwise grain of the fabric, and stitch it into your seam. Or you can use just a ribbon. You can use just a ribbon, and you can encase that into your seams as well. Okay, so it just depends on the technique that you're going to be working with. So now as I stitch this, and it's going to make that little gurgly noise because that's what Bernina does when they first get started. So now I'm just going to stitch this seam. Now if I have my seam allowance set, I can use that seam guide and stitch it in place. And you're like, yeah, that's no big deal. I do that all the time on my machine, right? Now sometimes what happens is that when you're stitching, and after you stitch and you pull on your seam, you may see little lines of thread showing through or on your seam. Okay? Okay? What you can do is, let's look back at the screen. Because on here we have what's called total stitch control. And many times it will happen more so on fabrics that are thick. Maybe you're sewing on a bag and you're going to be stitching that seam. So when you stitch this seam together, and you open the seam, you have little lines of stitching. Okay? So the way that a serger is designed, it's designed for flexibility in the seam, right? In order to get that flexibility, you need to have a little bit more of a loop that's formed so it stretches, right? If you want to prevent, and those stitches look kind of like little smiles or lines that you see on the outside. If you want to snug those up, all I need to do on the machine here is across the top, you see those little colored boxes? I call those chiclets. So those little chiclet boxes, I can adjust individually. So now I can touch this and I can increase the control of just one thread. So now when I sew that same line of stitching, it's going to stitch it, but I've increased the control of that thread. And then after I have it stitched, it actually holds that seam tighter. Okay? Simply by increasing just that one thread.
How do you know which one to increase?
You only have to increase the one when you pull. Remember, we generally say the only thread you need to use to match your fabric is what thread? Left needle thread. Okay? That's the one, that's the outer thread. So if there's any stress on the seam when you pull on it, that's the only thread you're going to see. But by being able to increase the control of that thread, you're pulling it tighter so you're not going to see that thread. Now, would I want to do that on a knit fabric? No, because I want the flexibility in that stitch. Okay, so you have what's called total stitch control. Yeah?
Is that available only on the Bernina?
Yes. Okay? Because you don't have control. Your automatic thread delivery does not give you control, right? I always say, total automatic thread delivery, is it easy? Yes. Is it accurate? Yes. Is it flexible? No. That's why when you want different stitches, you have to put the thread in different places, because that's how you maintain control on those threads. So here, I can just slide that little lever up and down to adjust each stitch. Now, some people, and notice I very seldom, if ever, use the T word. And what's the T word? Tension, right? Because when I use the T word, what happens to all of you? You get tense, right? So what I do is I'll call these, and honestly, from the very beginning when I worked with Baby Lock 37 years ago, we had sergers that had no numbers, that had no markings, and I use the term thread control knobs, because that's what they did. They control the amount of thread that's going onto your fabric or being held back, right? So when we're going to use this analogy. You are out walking through the parking lot with your kids or your grandkids, and you want more control over them so they don't go running loose, right? So what do? Grab on tighter to their hand or grab onto their shirt, right? But you have more control. More control makes them move less, okay? So if we use that same analogy on here, when we raise the number, more control, less thread is seen on your fabric piece. So now you take them to the park, or you're using a heavier thread, and you don't need as much control. Now you can lessen the number, you can bring it down, and you can adjust how much thread you see and how much thread is being held back, okay? And that's all you have to really know, because tomorrow we'll create different stitches. The same threading, creating 3 different kinds of stitches. And we never have to rethread our machine. We just slide those little levers up and down, okay?
So is there a default button?
Yep, so see the yellow rectangle that's there?
Yep.
Well, let me touch a different color so you can see it. See the yellow rectangle?
Yes.
So that yellow rectangle always means a change was made. And all I have to do is touch, and it brings it back to the default setting.
And the color corresponds with the...
Color corresponds to the top of your machine. Here?
Yes.
Yep. And, you know, cell phone companies should take a lesson from sergers, because all sergers from the very beginning of time have used the same color coding system. Yellow, blue, green, and red. Okay? And when you are moving your threads on your screen, we'll look at that in just a minute, it's going to show you exactly which color you need to use. Okay? All right. So that's a little bit about the control and adjustments that you can make. Now, if I'm going to be sewing together my seams, let's take a look then at a couple of samples that we have here. And we're going to look at some basic construction. Okay, so when you have basic construction, and I'll pull it off the wall there. But there is a really cute top. They have some very cute patterns right here against the wall. Okay, that's hanging on the break room door. Those are great patterns. Now, a lot of times people will say, oh, I don't sew for myself because I don't like how it fits, or I'm not sure if it's going to fit right. We're not having to make very fitted things. You can, when you buy things, are you buying things that are all fitted? No, probably not. So here you can make things that are unstructured, okay? And this is going to be just a very simple knit fabric. This one, the sleeve is just a raw edge. So it's not finished, okay? So that's, and the edges are also raw. So you can use that for piecing fabrics together. Now let me see what else I have under here. Or if you're going to be sewing on cotton fabrics. Now we're going to take a look at this. when you're gathering, or if you look at, we're going to look at also the the binder when we move over to the cover stitch. But here, the bottom of the hem was actually stitched using the binder. Okay? The binder was used to finish the edge of that. And the fabric, because many times you can find thread that matches, but you can't always find fabric that would match or coordinate with your fabrics. So you can make your own fabrics and with threads and coordinate it with the fabrics that you're wanting.
So cute.
Okay, isn't that cute? Okay, now you also have, let me show you. So let's say, and do you honestly know why I put that binding around the bottom of that hem? I didn't have time to serge around the bottom edge, turn it up, press it all the way around. It was faster. It was faster for me to do that. But if I have a piece of fabric that I'm going to hem a skirt edge like that, so it's like a circle skirt or a circle hem. So when you turn up the hem, you're going to somehow have to get rid of some of that fullness in your stitching, right? Or in your hem, or you're going to end up with a little tuck or a pleat there. So the first thing that I would do is I would thread my machine with the fusible thread. We used this yesterday for our binding, but I'm going to place this fusible thread again in my lower looper. Okay, so I'm going to put this in my lower looper, and when I stitch, let me untangle this thread just a minute. When I pulled up that thread, it got tangled. Okay, so when I'm going to stitch this, I'm going to take the fusible thread, place it in the lower looper, and I'm just rethreading that needle because I pulled the thread out. And I'm going to use my differential feed. So in the machine, when I stitch, I have a feature that's built into the machine that's called Creative Consultant. So when I touch the home page, I see this little dress form. And this little dress form, I touch that, and it gives me different fabric options. So now I'll take a look at those fabric options, and I'll see that I have knit and woven, and I'm just going to use a lightweight knit setting. So I'll use, and if I don't know what all of those settings mean, touch the question mark, and it lists all the different fabric settings under there. Okay? So now I'll touch that, the sewing advisor, and now I'm going to hem my fabric. But because I have this fullness in my fabric edge, I need to have my differential feed engaged. So I'll just touch gathering a little bit. And when I touch that on the screen, notice what it's done. It's changed all of the settings automatically for me. So now when I stitch this, I'm going to shorten my stitch just a little bit. Okay. So now as I stitch it, watch what it's going to do. It's going to kind of gather up my fabric. Now I may or may not need that many gathers in there. So it's set, and all I have to do is pull out those gathers, and when I turn my hem up and press it in place, remember fusible thread would be in that lower looper. See how it's pulled in that added fullness, and then I just press this and I can top stitch. Okay, I can top stitch that in place. So that makes it super easy to hem, again, a full hem edge. Okay?
So if you didn't have a Bernina and you had a baby lock, what would you
You would need to go into your differential feed. You'd need to you would adjust your differential feed up, and generally your length also, so that you would pull in the fabric. So do all of you understand what differential feed means or does? Okay. I'll still tell you. Okay, so if so looking at differential feed, okay, on your screen or normally outside, when you adjust the differential feed above the normal setting, you have 2 sets of feed dogs in your machine. So sometimes when you're working, do any of you have a machine that has a dual feed on it? Okay? Okay, where it pulls, you engage it, and pulls the fabric through. So dual feed pulls your fabric from behind the presser foot, where differential feed will feed more or less fabric from the front. Okay? So if you're sitting at your sewing machine and you want more fabric to go underneath your foot, what do? You take your fingers and kind of push it a little faster. So differential feed, moving it above the number 1 or normal setting, will take your front feed dogs and it will move the fabric in faster from the front than when it pulls it out the back, creating gathers or easing of your fabric. Or when they stitched this, when they cut this batting off, and yesterday when we were looking at piecing our battings back together with a flat lock stitch, if you do this with your battings, you might say, well, I do that at my sewing machine at home, right, with a zigzag. And you do that, and what happens is you end up with sometimes this little roller coaster, okay? And then you take it to your iron and you mash it down, and it gives little bumps where those little loopsies were. So with differential feed, it's going to feed in your, oh, sorry, I keep moving around here, sorry. You keep, it feeds in that fabric evenly front and pulling it out the back because it's not going to stretch it out of shape. Conversely, if you're working with a fabric that tends to pucker and you want the seams to lay nice and flat, you would take the differential feed and move it below the neutral setting, and just like you do on your sewing machine, you hold some tension on your fabric on the front and behind. So the front feed dog holds it back from feeding in as fast as the back feed dogs pull it out. Okay? So that's differential feed in a nutshell. Okay, so then when we're stitching, we had a request for sewing around, this is to be a circle-ish shape. Okay. Geometry was not my main focus, but also when you're going to be stitching, I am going to be putting in some decorative thread because this will be much easier to see. And let's pretend we're going to be stitching around a placemat when you do this. Or you're going around the hem, because you would do exactly the same thing. Now, what I like to call some of my stitches, when you come onto a circle, I call those on-ramp stitches. And when you go off, I call them off-ramp stitches, right? Because that's kind of what they look like. You trail on, and then you trail off, okay? But when we thread with, I'm going to put this decorative thread, we're just going to use 2 different kinds of threads here.
Is that a 12
These are both 12 weight threads. And I'm going to put these in my upper and lower looper. Okay, so I use the one-step air threading. There we go. All right, now I am going to set my stitch length. So let me get back to a 3-thread stitch. I'm using, oh, okay, so I want to use the right needle thread. There we go. All right. Now, when I stitch this, typically, when you're stitching, I'm going to stitch a little bit and then I'm going to swing the foot out of the way and show you, because when you have stitches that are formed on the stitch fingers, okay, your stitches are formed right here on these stitch fingers, right? So if you take your fabric and you try to slide it under, see how it pushes that edge of fabric? Okay, yes, you're going to be able to do this on your baby lock. So when you stitch this, you're going to want to make sure that you pull the thread off of your stitch finger, okay? So it's clear. Now I can slide my fabric clearly underneath the presser foot, okay? So pulling, just your foot stays in place. You just pull the stitches from the back. It slides those stitches off the stitch finger. Then you slide your fabric in and you have a, I'll call it square, okay, 90-degree angle that you are stitching. Now, as you stitch this, and I'm going to just shorten my stitch length just a little bit, and as you stitch around, you always want to have your fabric in front of your presser foot. It's also best if you use a curve foot, because the curve foot, and I don't think I put one in here, okay, but the curve foot is shorter. So if you're going to be doing, and it's clear, and when you're going around curves, using that curve foot will allow you to stitch a much smaller circle, okay? But when you practice this, it's actually easier for you to start with a bigger circle and move to a smaller one. All right, so I'm coming around my circle. Now I'm reaching the point where I started stitching, okay? And I'm going to hold this tail nice and tight. So I'll bring this around, let the blade nip off that tail, okay? Then I take my cutting blade and I lower the cutting blade. Now when I stitch the remaining few stitches, all right, I'm not cutting into, okay? I'm not cutting into the already stitched part, okay? Okay? All right. Now, how do I get off? I overlap those stitches just a few stitches. Then I'm going to raise my presser foot and take the fabric and swing it completely to the back and sew off. All right? Now, so this is, let me just snip this little thread right there. Okay? So when I snip, here's the other thing. You will always put a little dab of fray check on here first, let it dry, and then cut it. Okay? If you cut it right now, fray check. Fray check, fray block, seam sealant of some kind, right? But you always, especially with a thread like this that's slippery, if you cut it right now, it's going to wing start to come apart. So always fray check, let it dry. Plan for 5 extra minutes in your project before you cut the tail off. All right? Yes, question?
Don't thread the tail back in.
You can. You can. I typically don't. I just cut. Now, if I'm doing anything for kids, then yes, I would thread it back in. But if you're working with a thread that is slippery, it can slide back out. Okay? Now, while we're here, and we're having such a good time beginning and ending things, let me show you a little trick, because this could also be a way that when you're doing a shoulder seam isn't as critical because you're going to put your sleeve in and you're going to put your neckline on, right? But if you have you're doing an underarm seam and you have the bottom where you might not have a hem, okay? You want to have a way to seal off the beginning and the ending, right? So the first thing that, and you would typically not do this with decorative thread, right? So what we're going to do is stitch onto your fabric like 2 stitches, 2 or 3 stitches, okay? Your needle's going to be up, and you're going to bring your thread tail around and under the foot. Check this out. And I always pull it up so I can see it. All right? Is my hand in the way there? All right. So now I'm going to just stitch over that tail a little bit, drag it down, let it cut off. Okay? So now the beginning is locked in place. Like that. Okay? All right. Now, at the end, and I'll show you the beginning and the end. So we're going to come to the end, and at the end of your fabric, you go 1 stitch off the edge of your fabric. Just 1. Then we're going to raise our foot, pull the threads, because when you lift your presser foot, your tension discs are open. You then flip your fabric over, okay, slide it back up underneath your presser foot, okay. Before you sew, pull on your threads, and that snugs them all up, okay. Now, what do you think I do with my cutting blade? Drop it out of the way, so when I come back over, I don't cut the stitches that I just made, okay. So now I have the, that's better than weaving. So now I have the beginning, okay, and I have the ending, okay, and they're sealed off, okay.
But what if you have to do that
Around. Okay, so we're going to get, when we move over in just a few minutes, we're going to move over to the sewing around in a circle, okay, and how you overlap those stitches. But you always you also watch the markings that are on the toe of the presser foot, so that where the beginning stitches are starting to show, you're starting to line it up with the marking that's on the toe of your presser foot, because then you know it's going to line up. Okay? All right. Now, when you're stitching, you also have an
especially when you have 2 needles when you do like flat locking?
correct. So flat locking, cover stitching. Cover stitching, right. Okay, so let's move over real quick then to the cover stitch. So when I move over to the cover stitch, and I have some things that I want to share with you on that, you can move very quickly, okay, and you do have both the guided and the expert mode. So I'm just going to go to a narrow cover stitch. So let me place my decorative thread in the chain looper. So all my threading takes place on the front. And I'm just going to use that decorative thread in the chain looper. Tomorrow we're going to look at this as a more decorative. Today we're just going to use it for a decorative hem. Okay. And when we're set for that cover stitch for hemming and stitching in the middle of our fabric, we're just going to move our needles, which I don't have a, did I set it down on the table?
Are you looking for a foot?
No, I'm looking for the little Allen wrench.
I see it.
Oh, here it is. See, if I put my toys where they belong, I would know where they are. Okay. Okay. There we go. So I'm using the center and the right needle position. And it doesn't, if I want to use, a wide cover stitch, I use the left and the right needle positions. There we go. Dropsies today.
Okay,
One
so
more.
3 times, so we're good.
Does this make you all feel better?
It definitely does.
We're all human here. Okay, so we have it threaded for a narrow cover stitch, and you were looking to stitch in the round. So when I attach my cover stitch table, that is the flat sewing table, buried under here somewhere. Okay. And when I select the stitch, that stitch in narrow cover stitch, okay, and my upper looper is down, okay, and that's the way it is on all sergers. When you're moving to the cover stitch function, well, does anybody see an extra table there? No. All right, well, I'm just going to use this table and take my binder.
No, on the top, by the box. Oh, no, it's the top of the thing.
Oh, there it is, though. Thank you.
It's where it belongs.
It's where it belongs. Amazing. Okay, now, one thing that you will find when you're stitching, you have these markings that are on the top of your flat sewing table. Okay? And a lot of times what I like to do when I am hemming is I will take the edge of my fabric and I will fold up my hem, and I lay my hem down upside down first on the bed. And you have all these markings on your baby lock machine too, where you would, let me just select this stitch. Okay, and I lay my fabric down so that I know where I'm going to be guiding. Okay, you can use the standard presser foot, you can use the chain stitch foot, which is the little narrow foot. Okay. And I'm going to pull out that lock stitch tool. Okay? Now, if you're going to be, I was going to sew this with a 4-thread stitch when we were over there on 4-thread. Or you can also use the compensation foot. And the compensation foot will level out your fabric from left to right. So this has the little floaters that are on the foot itself, so that as you stitch, it will track the edge of your fabric. And if you have one fabric, your hem is heavier on one side than it is the other, then it's going to level out and stitch over those seams easier, okay?
Is there any foot like that for the baby doll?
No, there is not. That one is a definite no. Okay, so now we have the position that we're going to be stitching, and when you stitch your hem, okay, you just follow that line. Now at the end of that stitching, a lot of times what I like to do is use the that hem tape or that little tape that I showed you earlier, just to put a little bit of support in that hem, okay? So it doesn't stretch completely out of shape. Now to lock the stitch, I just raise the foot, take the needle threads with either my Allen wrench or this lock stitch tool, and I pull the threads forward, cut the thread, and now my needle threads right here are going to be pulled to the underside, and that locks my stitch, okay? That just locks the stitch at the end, so it's not going to pull apart, okay? Now, if I'm going to be stitching and I stitch with a knit fabric and I'm stitching over a seam, right? Sometimes that's where it kind of pulls it off to the left-hand side as you're stitching over that seam. So what you can do is you can take your seam, and I'm just going to even this up. Decide where your hem is going to be. The first thing that you're going to do is take your scissors and you're going to cut into your seam allowance, not cutting your stitching line, okay? You're going to then take one seam allowance and press it one way, and one you're going to press the opposite way, okay? This cut takes place right at the seam, right at the hemline, okay, right at the hemline. So then you can also use a piece of Wonder Tape and place it right in that hem, fold this over and press it, so it's going to hold that seam in place, okay? Now, when you fold your fabric up, your thickness is going to be distributed across your seam, okay? So now as you stitch across, you're going to also have a much easier time of getting over that seam, okay? But also, when you start to stitch, there is nowhere in any place that it ever tells you you have to sew 100 miles an hour all the time, all the way over at one, you know. So, yeah, you can sew. Plus, you also have pressure adjustment. So if you, on all of your sergers, Triumphs, Evolutions, you have pressure, foot pressure adjustment. Here I make the pressure adjustment at the top of the machine, and I'm simply lessening the pressure so it doesn't push the top layer of fabric, okay? So I can make that adjustment on the thickness of that fabric. Now as I come to the seam, you may see that the foot pushes the top fabric just a little teeny bit. So what you can do is lift the foot, push it just a little bit, but also come onto your screen or on your machine and lengthen your stitch by 2 or 3 marks, 2 or 3 settings. because then as you come over the seam, it naturally shortens your stitch length, okay? You can then also, and these work with both Baby Locks and Bernina's, but they are from Bernina's, and you just slide it underneath the back end of your presser foot, okay? Keeping your presser foot even, and now as you sew, you're going to sew over that seam. You get over the seam, you go back to your standard setting, and sew the rest of your hem, okay? So now I have the seam. Can you see the difference here? So here I have, this is a narrow cover stitch. This is a wide cover stitch, okay? And I use that same technique on both sides so that they lay nice and flat and you don't have it pulling to the left, because that happens a lot when you're stitching and it pulls it over to the side, okay? Yes?
That's my biggest problem. That's been worth 3 days just to hear that, because it happens to me constantly.
Yeah.
So, I have a Baby Lock. Am I using the wrong presser? What presser foot should I be using for this?
The chain and cover stitch foot, because, and here's why, okay, the narrow foot. The standard presser foot has this extra piece that comes out the side, okay? So as you would be stitching over a seam, the outside edge or the inside edge of this foot is going to hang up on your seam, okay? By using a chain and cover stitch foot, that part is missing. So there isn't any place for it to hang up or catch on the extra fabric that is off to the side of your hem. Okay? Yeah.
Then do you have to do circular?
Yes. So when we're doing a circle, let's join this together. Okay? You would not hem this with you wouldn't seam it with a cover stitch. Okay. All right. So how many times do you make mistakes and you need to pull out your mistake? Okay, never. You don't even own a seam ripper. Oh. Seam rippers are our best friends sometime. So you saw how I took the cover stitch, the lock tool, and I pulled the thread forward and I locked the stitch. So what I need to do, and this one, we're going to unlock the stitch, and you pull out the last 2 stitches on the needle side.
Can you hold it onto the light more, please?
Sure. And of course, I would have to pick a fleecy fabric.
Do you have a regular fabric?
The last 2 stitches.
The last 2 stitches on the needle side. Okay. And I'm doing it from the chain side because I can see it a little bit better. Okay. So what I've done is I have just unlocked by pulling out those last 2 stitches, and now I can just pull on my chain thread and pull it out. Okay? But here's the trick. You have to pull it from the end where you stopped sewing. You have to remember. So sometimes you have to hold your fabric and go, did I sew it this way? Did I sew it that way? And if when you pull it, it doesn't pull easily from one direction, go the other side. Go to the other side. Okay, so I'm just going to sew this, and we're going to do we're going to pretend this is sewn together with an overlock stitch, and we're just going to do a hem going around the circle, okay? Because I meant to do that when we were in overlock. Okay? So now when I'm going to do this hem, and I'm going to, again, take my hem where I had clipped it, and I'm going to fold it up right on that hem line. So now I have the circle. All right. Now, do I start directly on a seam? No. No. I generally start part way in the middle of that seam, but I will approach the seam pretty quick. Now, I'm just going to, if I were doing this on a machine that did not have a free arm, then I would be sewing, I would probably sew around the inside, okay? So I do have the free arm, so I can take my fabric and I can slide it over the free arm, okay? And now as I stitch, watching these marks that are on the toe of my presser foot, I'm just going to, I'm sorry?
Starting is not the problem.
Yeah, no, starting is not the problem, okay? So we're going to come to that seam, all right? Then we're going to lengthen our stitch just a little bit. We're going to take this little compensation tool, slide it under the foot so that it stitches right over that seam, and there's different thicknesses or sizes. So now I'm coming around where I started, right? So I want to take my scissors and any little threads I cut off the thread at the very beginning, okay? No threads showing there. But I'm taking the markings that are on the toe of my presser foot and I'm aiming them at the stitching lines, okay, that are on the toe of the foot. Now, as I approach this, sometimes I will take my foot and swing it out of the way and see if I am coming close. Then I can lower it back down and, stitch wrong way. So now as I stitch, I can go stitch by stitch to overlap those stitches by maybe 1/4 of an inch, okay? Now, here is where you do raise your foot, take your lock stitch tool or your Allen wrench, and you pull the stitches forward, cut the threads, slide it out from under your foot, and see how it's buried those threads? Okay? And now it's overlapped. Okay? But it's important to aim those markings that are on the toe of your presser foot right with the lines of stitching that are already there on your fabric. Okay? All right. Now, what you can also do is when you're going to be stitching and you're using your cover stitch, here are some garment ideas for you. This one, the lines of stitching that are at the bottom of the skirt are, oh, here, we'll put it here. You'll be able to see it. So this is a wide and a narrow cover stitch, just for adding texture and stripes at the bottom of that skirt. But I hemmed it with the wide cover stitch. So this is really a two-step process. So I stitched it first with a narrow cover stitch, which is the red, okay? Then I flipped it over and stitched the wide cover stitch on top of it. Okay? So I didn't have a stitching line and it was finished. Okay? So that's wide and, okay? So I took my I took my fabric. Oh, do I have one that has a right and a wrong side? This one's pretty narrow. Well, okay. So I took my fabric and I folded it to the wrong side like my hem would be, right? And I stitched my hem with the narrow cover stitch like normal, okay? Like normal. So I just stitched it. Okay? So I had my narrow cover stitch on the back side hemmed my skirt. Then when I stitched the next line of stitching, I flipped my fabric over, so now I'm sewing from the wrong side, and my decorative thread showed on the right side of my fabric. Does that make sense? Okay. So I took my,
And it should be wider.
and it will be wider. So then I moved my needle. Let me see if I can drop how many times I can drop the Allen wrench now. So all I have to do is move it over to the wide cover stitch. Okay.
Did you have to rethread it when you moved it over?
No, no. The needle thread I didn't. And that's on any machine.
Oh, okay.
If you move your needles, if it's in the center and you want to do a wide cover stitch, you don't need to do that. Yes, question.
You stated that if you have a free arm, that you can do it from the opposite side.
Mhm.
If you do not have a free arm, you have to use it from the
You-
other.
You don't have to, but it's easier when you're stitching without a free arm. Even on a sewing machine, you would sew on the inside. It's easier than trying to fold your, yeah.
But then isn't it, follow up her question, then isn't it going to give a
You're
different
stitching.
appearance rather than the parallel straight
No, you
line?
just turn it inside out and
Yeah.
stitch it this way.
It's stitching inside out, not upside down.
Okay.
Yeah. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is a free arm?
What is a free arm? Okay, so on right here on your like on your sewing machine, when you're sewing around, okay, some and most other sergers, this area is closed. So you are always sewing flat. Okay? All right. So when I stitched the decorative portion of that hem, I stitched then upside down. And also, ladies and gentlemen, did you know that to release your thread, when you come off the edge of your fabric, turn your hand wheel the opposite direction as you're pulling, and your threads will free themselves up. Okay? Now I would have that.
That's only with the chain.
That's only with the chain.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, because when I say if you're doing four thread,
Yeah, you just
it up.
sew right off.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay? All right. So you have your cover stitch. Now, that's how that hem was done. So other cover stitch items. So this is a cover stitch. Okay? So you have a decorative cover stitch that you can do just by using a decorative thread in your chain looper. You're just stitching rows of stitches, okay? This is also just decorative rows of stitches, but do you see the texture that's on there? That is using the Stitch and Steam, and you lay that behind your fabric and stitch it onto your top fabric and then steam it, and it just shrinks up. Okay? So that's what I used there, and also on this little dress in the bodice. I mean in the midriff there. Okay?
Did you stitch it before or after?
You always stitch before. You always stitch before and let it shrink up.
But we're shrinking them together.
Yes.
My question is, yes, you can prepare fabric and then stitch it. The stitch would be more even versus.
It depends on what look you're going for. If you want, yes, if you don't want your stitches to shrink up, then you could make the fabric, you could stitch just straight lines and then shrink it up and then do your cover stitching on top of those straight lines. Yes?
So that's not like shirring where it's stretchy.
No. No.
It has that look, but it doesn't stretch.
Right.
correct?
This is not stretchy. Okay?
Cut your pattern after you stretch.
Cut your pattern after you make your fabric. Yes. Question back. You had a question in the purple? Right here? Did you have a question?
Yeah, that was it. Make sure you cut your fabric after you make it.
Absolutely. Yes.
When you wash that, does it stretch back out?
No. No. It's, I tell everyone I didn't sew this lining in place just so I could show you this. But see how you just have straight lines of stitching that are on that fabric. And that fabric shrinks up and it stays that size. It doesn't get larger or any smaller. It'll stay that size. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what is that called again?
It's called Stitch and Steam. Stitch and Steam.
There's a little dress over there.
Did you do that on that little dress right there too? That other little dress? She's got it.
No, that
No.
because I stretched it.
Yeah. On the back of that little dress, it's just a channel where elastic is run through. Okay? Now, we're out of time. But are we? Oh no, I thought it was 4 o'clock. Oh, we have a half an hour yet. Oh, here I'm just whipping through things because I'm like, I'm out of time. Okay, so this, okay? All right, yes, Shades of Martha. And this is serger smocking. This is done with the differential feed and a wide cover stitch. So when I do this stitching, again, you start with a large piece of fabric and these stitches are made the width of the foot apart. Okay, and it's a wide cover stitch with the differential feed, and as you're stitching it, it's gathering up your fabric. And you're just doing row after row after row, and it continually pleats your fabric.
With what foot?
You can use your standard foot. You can use your cover stitch foot. I like to use my cover stitch foot, again, because it's narrower. It's narrower, and it's not going to catch. It's not going to catch the additional lines of stitching that you have made on the fabric.
But the pink colored thread was on a regular.
The pink colored thread that's on here, the decorative stitches that are on here, on top of it. When you buy a sewing machine, you always ask, well, how many stitches does it have? And then we use 4, right? So this gives you an opportunity to use your decorative stitches on top of your serger stitches.
While you're doing the pleating, you're doing the stitch. This decorative
Uh,
stitch is going across.
What's that? Say,
While you're doing the pleating, your decorative stitch is going
no, no, no.
That's why I asked,
Yeah.
because
All right, let me show you.
You're doing the pleating before the decorative stitch?
Okay, here's a piece of fabric. Since we have time, we'll do a little bit of this. Okay. Now, you will see why it's only this big. Okay? Because it gathers up a lot. So I'm going to put a regular thread in my chain looper, and I do have a wide cover stitch set on the machine. Okay? I will put this back on so I have some support. We can move those over. So I have my wide cover stitch with the cover stitch foot Okay. And just regular thread in the chain looper. Okay.
So you're set up for a wide cover stitch.
Yep,
Okay.
a wide cover stitch.
Just making sure.
Okay.
No.
Okay, my differential feed, my length is going to be on 4.5. Differential feed is on 2.
Is that lower or higher?
Higher. Higher. Mm-hmm.
So what, that means it will increase the flow, this, right,
Yep, it's going to push more fabric in.
more fabric.
Yeah, it'll be gathering. Okay, it'll be gathering. So now as I stitch, see how it gathers up the fabric? Now also this is not something you start in an afternoon where the baptism is the next day. Okay? So you do want to give yourself some time when you do this, and I will always kind of pull the stitch off rather than lock the stitch. It's just what I do. All right, so then I used the edge, oops, I flipped it this way, because I want the outside edge of my foot to be the guide for the next lines of stitching. Okay? And now as I stitch this, see how my right hand is kind of pushing or tickling the fabric in under the foot? And my left hand is keeping the outside edge straighter. Okay? Okay? Now it's going to gather up a little bit more each time you stitch. And again, this is, you start with a piece of fabric that is much bigger than what you're going to end up with. Okay? This is exactly why, see why I did just that little teeny dress?
Now, I see that you finish, you cut, and you start what you started. What happens if you finish sewing and just turn the fabric to start the other line?
It won't be even. The width of my foot from the left side to the right side is not the same distance. So if that matters, you know, you could do that. Okay, you could just turn it around and go the other way. But then when you would do, your lines of stitching would not be consistent.
Right.
Okay? So then after I had all those lines stitched, then I pressed these all flat and then did decorative stitches on top of all of those little pleats that were made.
So the decorative stitches, Pam, would go on top of the pleated space in between
I did it on,
stitching,
I did it right on top of the cover stitching.
on top of the
Yeah,
cover stitching.
sewing with the right side facing up.
Okay.
Okay.
On your sewing machine?
On the sewing machine. Yes, so the decorative stitches on that little dress were done with the sewing machine. So hand me that little dress again, the flowered one. Okay. So those pink stitches are decorative stitches on my sewing machine.
So you're sewing on the back side of the...
No, the top side. The top side.
And why aren't you getting... No, I mean for the cover stitch. Because you're only getting the two lines.
Yes.
You're sewing
On the
side of the fabric.
No, this is the right side of my fabric. The two straight lines. The two straight lines of stitching. Whenever you, here.
You see, you don't want to see cover stitch.
You don't want to see the cover stitch. So when you sew with the right side of your fabric facing up, you will always see, oh, I'm not need to gather, but you will always see two straight lines of stitching, okay? With the right side of your fabric facing up, you always see two straight lines of stitching, okay? On the other side, okay, you see your chain looper, okay? Yeah, you have that, yeah, right. So it just depends on what side of the stitch you're wanting to see as to what side of the fabric you have facing up or down. Yes?
To continue with your technique with this project,
Uh-huh.
you could obviously see when you were showing it that it shrunk as you continued. Did you start then with the decorative stitch from the center and work back out?
No.
Because no, you just went ahead.
So I took a piece of fabric. Actually, I think if I remember, I started with a piece of a 45-inch width fabric, and it kept getting narrower and narrower and narrower, right? So then I would lay my fabric flat at the sewing machine, right side facing up, and I would do my decorative lines of stitching, the decorative stitches, right on top of those little pleats that were made.
Did you press that first?
Yes. Yeah, I would press that so all my lines were nice and flat. Uh-huh.
Just to clarify, when you started this in the beginning, you were you on the wrong side?
Right side.
Right side, so you have the cover stitch showing.
No. No. See the two lines? See the two lines of stitching on the top side? This is the right side of my fabric, and it's the needle side that I'm seeing. Okay?
The cover stitch, no?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, that just shows the cover stitch, yeah. On the back is just
Is the chain.
right, the back
Yes.
is the chain.
The back is the chain, which you could use that as the right side also, if you, exactly. Yeah. So you could use either side.
So you're the same, they're all
Yeah. You know, Nancy Zeman always said you pay for both sides of your fabric. Well, when you buy a serger, you pay for both sides of the stitch, right? So you could use either side of that stitch. Now, here's something else. So this takes some time to do. This is making your own fabric with a chain stitch on netting, okay?
That is beautiful.
Okay?
That's a lot of straight work.
And that is just regular serger thread on netting so it stays soft. So that it just gives you the texture rather than, I was mimicking lace at this point. So using just a regular thread, okay?
Pam, did you use any stabilizer?
No. No stabilizer, no wash away.
How long did it take you?
It took 9 hours to make the fabric. I know. And I started with 2 brand new spools of serger thread, used all of it. That's the first time I'd ever, netting. Netting.
You made the netting and then you made garment.
Yeah, it took 45 minutes to make the garment and 9 hours to make the fabric. Yeah, but it's one of those things where, yeah, what are you, crazy? Why would you ever do that? But sometimes you just need a little something, not this, but yeah, you can't find fabric, or you can, and it doesn't have to be straight lines. And believe me, these are not straight. They were like, wow, and it was a. Depends what you're asking for. Sorry, Jake. Now, if you're asking for a new serger, anybody want to borrow this tonight? You certainly can. You could do. Oh, that broadcast over the whole store. Okay. Oh my gosh, this is being recorded for YouTube. Cut that part out. Huh?
It will not work on Janice.
It will not work on Janice. That's right, that's right. Okay, here's a couple more garment things. Because you can use these cover and chain stitches, well, now this is the same shirt, but a different setup. And I used the cover stitch more as an embellishment, okay, on the edge of the lace and just on the edge of the outside edge of the decorative stitch. So this is not extra panels of fabric that are all sewn together. It's just lines of stitching that were placed on the fabric itself.
But
Okay?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
The green stitching was not done in the serger, right?
This green stitching?
Yeah.
No, that's a sewing machine stitch. You know, you got to give your sewing machine a little love every now and again. But adding those decorative stitches, you know, and so here's the thing. I want to have any of the stitches and things, and tomorrow we'll talk about embellishment. But when you do all of these decorative things, whether it's embroidery or serging or quilting, you want your stitching to enhance whatever you're doing, right? It needs to be tastefully applied to whatever you're doing and not look like your machine, like you've either tried too hard or that your machine has thrown up stitches all over, you know, because it can look like that sometimes. This is, yeah, chain stitch work on the right side, sewing with the wrong side of your fabric facing up. Okay, so here's a pair of jeans that goes with that top. Did you love it? So we'll bring this back tomorrow too when we talk about this two-color stitch that's there. But here you have flat lock stitching. When we stitched, we had stacked cover stitching. So there's 3 different stitches layered on top of each other, okay, when you're stitching. Now, the key in that one is, and look at the underside, if I ever do this again, I will change the color of needle thread each time I stitch. Because when I stitch the first line, I'm like, yeah, no big deal. Now I'm going to put more of the same colored threads, and I don't know what line I'm following. Okay? So change your needle threads at the same time that you're changing the color of your top threads. Is it necessary? No. Is it helpful? Yes. Yes. Okay. So that's that. Now, here's another. This is, on this skirt, we used the triple cover stitch for top stitching on the seams. So this is a gored skirt, and then we did the top stitching from the right side facing down, wrong side facing up, and then just stitched. This is also a variegated thread. So it gives you that color change in the stitching, but it adds to the look, the final look of that project, right? Yeah. Okay? But we're using a standard, we're using the standard seam allowance, but we just finished the seam edges so that when we did that cover stitching on top, it was all flat, right? So we didn't have to worry about the bump in the seam allowance, so the seam laid flat. Okay, so then you have, this is just a basic sweatshirt type jacket. And the seam, the binding was put on with a 4-thread overlock stitch. The seaming was done with a 4-thread overlock stitch, okay, joining it all together. And just as we talked about yesterday with sewing our quilts, how that 4-thread, the 4-thread overlock stitch will compress the seam allowance and it'll help it lay flatter than a 3-thread, and it'll give more structure and stability to an overlock stitch, just a basic 3-thread stitch. Now also, what we did is, this is again a little sneak peek into our embellishment, but then we took the decorative thread and we ran a chain, whether it was a rolled hem or it was a chain from our chain stitch, and then wove it. You can use Pam's, those little great 1/2-inch snipper scissors, and you could snip into your fabric and it would create those little cuts in your fabric, and then you just weave that chain and thread on beads as you would like, okay? And then wide cover stitching, you see that little tuck that's there? So your wide cover stitch, because you have control of your threads, you can increase. So when you do twin needle work on your sewing machine, sometimes it creates that little tunnel. Here we intentionally created the tunnel by pulling our chain looper thread tighter so that it created that little tunnel on our fabric. Yeah? Yes. If you tighten it all the way up, and if you want to have your tension, this is on any machine. If you want to have your machine tension or control increased, take your thread and wrap it around your spool, your telescoping thread guide.
Can you show that again?
Sure. So you just take the thread and you wrap it and give it a test and see if that's enough. If it's not, wrap it again.
That increases the tension.
Yeah, that increases your tension. Now,
Why do you don't move the control, the bottom control?
it may not be enough. So if you need it, like this is a pretty heavy sweatshirt fleece, right? If you take your tension and you raise it all the way up, and it may still not pull it quite enough, take your thread and wrap it around your telescoping thread guide. That puts more tension on your thread. You have to be careful, because if you wrap this too many times, your thread's going to go snap. Okay? So be careful on your, don't wrap too tight. Okay? Don't wrap too tight. Okay. So this is also, I love this because it shows see that circle that's on the back? That's done with a curve foot. So your curve foot you can use with either overlock stitching or cover stitching, and by sewing in that circle, overlapping, just like we showed you earlier, you can start and you can stop and not see where it's joined, okay? If you do, that's a perfect opportunity to put some beads right there, okay? Or a little embellishment, okay? Because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But one thing I do want to tell you about going around curves, or if you're doing like a blanket edge, if you do either a blanket stitch or just a 3-thread overlock stitch, and you're going around a curve on an outside, draw the curve. Use Pam's curve ruler. What's 7-in-1? 7-corner ruler. Draw your corner. Let your machine cut it. Because if you've ever had where you're sewing along and you come to a curve that's already cut, you're sewing along, and as you come around the curve, your loops kind of start to fall off the edge. But if you let your machine cut it, then your loops are always going to be on the edge. Okay? So draw the curve, let your machine cut the curve, and then your loops will always be right on the edge of your fabric. Okay? And use that curve foot. So again, using your chain and cover stitches just for embellishing your fabrics, sometimes that's all it needs, is just a little bit of...
Is that fleece?
This is a sweatshirt fleece.
Oh my God.
This is a sweatshirt. And you can take, so in the Serger Essentials book, This is one of Gail's patterns. And she shows you how to do this in the Serger Essentials book. And you actually get two or a large sweatshirt, and you open it through the front. And then she also shows you how, if you want to have darts or a little more shaping to it. So it's not just a sweatshirt, right? So it takes it up another level. And then she also used then a fabric binding, just a cotton or a cotton knit for that binding. Okay, and just this one also is a dress that using your binder, and we'll show that tomorrow, using your binder or just stitching on strips of fabric, and then using the triple or wide cover stitch and just making strips of fabric and then cutting the little slits and weaving through those little strips of fabric. Isn't that cute?
Can you hold that up to the camera?
Oh, sure. Sorry. I keep forgetting that. It's a little hard to see with the black.
Oh, okay.
You see that?
Yeah, that is.
Okay. But see how there's just those little strips?
Does it tear the fabric then?
No. No. I mean,
It depends what the fabric is.
this is a knit. This is a knit. I mean, you would want to... Yeah, it's like doing a bunch of buttonholes. Yeah, you don't... These are just raw. Now, behind it is a piece of that stabilizer. So it's going to stabilize the fabric first so that it doesn't like tear out. Okay? But
How do you fix those short pieces, for example, here and here?
how do you secure them?
Yes.
Okay, so what stabilizer is it? It's like that easy knit interfacing that's on the back side. And on the ends, they're just actually loose.
So how they are not pulled out?
Oh, right here, it's actually tacked. It's tacked in place right at the bottom.
Very careful.
Just like one or two little tacks of the stitching that's there. Okay? All right. So tomorrow we're going to talk even more about embellishment and things that you can do with your serger stitches to embellish your fabrics. Talk about thread blending. Somebody was here or looking earlier about how to blend embroidery threads. Who was that? Who was I talking to about that earlier? Somebody. But this particular line of stitching has 5 spools of embroidery thread that were blended together to create that colored stitch. Okay? So we'll talk about that tomorrow and show you how to blend those threads, but also how to thread, because it'll be a little different threading technique for that. Okay? All right.
Do you know what pattern you use for that little first black and white jacket with full pleat in the back?
That I'll send are you going to be here tomorrow? Okay. I'll ask Gail tonight. That's one of her samples, and I'll ask her. It might be one of her patterns. Okay?